edition of the. Hey everyone, welcome back to another edition of Kelp Cam Live with the Birch Aquarium. My name is Alan. Joined with me today is Anshika, aka Ansharka, one of our favorite shark experts in the education team. She's awesome. I'm awesome, and we're here to talk to you guys about winter time in the kelp forest. So unfortunately, the aquarium did have to close due to the new state regulations for at least 3 weeks or so. But we're very happy to be back here with you guys doing another kelp camp. So glad we can still reach out and connect with everyone. Anshika, how are you doing today?
I'm doing awesome. I always love watching our super awesome kelp forest just go back and forth, and it looks really great today. And I'm really excited to talk about how all of these really cool animals are able to stay warm and kind of just survive in the kelp forest as the waters are starting to get chilly.
Yeah. So as everyone knows, it's winter time, and I know we live here at the Birch Aquarium. We're down in Southern California. We're here in a beautiful sunny San Diego. I'm looking outside, and there's not a cloud in the sky, but it still gets cold around here. Like we're still experiencing winter. And if you're like me or a lot of people here who go in the ocean, one of the biggest things you notice throughout the winter changes is the water gets really cold in the ocean here. So we don't get snowstorms. We don't get too much rain throughout the year, even though we get more rain here in the winter. But one of the biggest changes I'd say I notice when winter's come along is that the water temperature gets really, really cold. Not freezing cold, it's not the Arctic here, but it's definitely a noticeable change. And it's so noticeable that, a lot of these animals you see in the kelp forest, they have to learn how to adapt to that. So, you go outside and you put on your nice warm coat. Fish don't have coats to wear. I'm sure you know that. But they do have a lot of other cool adaptations and ways that they can stay warm. So something we just like to point out before we get started talking about the animals is just, I guess, how exactly cold it does get in the kelp forests and the waters around here. So, there's a big difference in kelp forests between here and maybe up in Central California and Northern California. And around winter time, the water temperature is going to be more around it's going to be around like 51 degrees, more up in like northern beaches up in Northern California, more around 60 degrees here when you get towards Southern California. And there's about like a 10 degrees difference between that and the summer. In the summer, it can be anywhere like around like 68 to 70. If it's a really warm summer, maybe more more in the low 70s here in Southern California. And then when you get up into the northern parts of California, it does get a little warmer in the summer. But then, of course, because it is Northern California, Central California, it's always going to be a little colder than it is here.
Definitely.
And it's kind of interesting. Yeah, the water temperature can actually change really rapidly around here depending on the season. I remember at one point over summer, it was about 70 degrees one day. And then a few days later, it was, closer to the mid 50s. That usually happens. Anshika, do you know what the name of like the event, or do you know why it might change so rapidly over like a day's time?
Yeah, so we have here in San Diego, water temperature changes super rapidly. Some days, like you were saying, Alan, some days you can go out in just a swimsuit and be totally fine. Next day, you go out in the same outfit, you freeze your buns off. It's very different. And that's actually due to this thing called upwelling. And that's what happens when, just due to wind, kind of the water moves around a bit and it brings up cold water from the deep.
Yeah, exactly. And we'll go in more depth with what upwelling is towards the end of the live stream, because we want to get to the cool animal stuff first. But yeah, upwelling is something we'll definitely talk about and go into more depth. And something I'd like to point out for the audience, if you guys want to think about this while we're talking about the animals, is a good question is, how might the actual giant kelp forests be affected? So not just the animals, but the actual kelp you see itself. So remember, the giant kelp is what you see floating up in here. It's really, really, really cool type of flora that lives in the ocean. It's got a holdfast, which is similar to a root system for trees. The holdfast literally does what it sounds like. It holds onto rocks and substrates in the ocean. And then it has its stipe, which grows up that's like its stem. So similar to how plants have stems, kelp has stipes, and they also have floats and blades. So floats are the little bubbles of air you might see when you see kelp washed up, and the blades are at the end of those floats. And so as you can see, the kelp is going straight up. That's because one of the main things that kelp needs to grow is light, so they can perform, so they can get their food, get their energy. And so the floats help the kelp float up to the surface, as the name implies, where it can reach the most sunlight. So just a little thing to consider when thinking about how winter time, might affect the actual kelp itself in the kelp forest. But in the meantime, why don't we check out some of the animals we see swimming around here? Anshika, do you know, what's it like for an animal in the ocean? Like, how do animals around stay warm, because they can't put on new layers and clothes? What do animals do?
Yeah, definitely. First, I just wanted to say that if anyone's new here, this is a live stream that you can use even without us. So this is our live kelp cam, and you can tune in on our website, Birch Aquarium. Just search Birch Aquarium Kelp Cam. You can get this camera all the time. I definitely use it very often. But basically, I want to also ask you guys if anyone watching has any ideas about how animals stay warm in our cold waters. So first, we can kind of go into the ideas of an ectotherm versus an endotherm. Alan, do you know anything about kind of what those terms might mean?
Yeah, so endotherm and ectotherm, it's kind of, I guess it you can kind of look at mammals and almost like reptiles, animals that are cold-blooded or make their own heat. It has something to do with the way they produce their heat to keep themselves warm, right?
Yeah, exactly. So endotherms are creatures like us that make their heat inside their own bodies, and ectotherms are creatures that will actually get the warmth from outside their bodies. So that'll be animals that are constantly sunning themselves, cold-blooded animals. So a lot of the animals in the ocean, we got kind of a mix. Some animals are warm-blooded, some are cold-blooded. And a big way that animals out here will stay warm is using basically a big layer of fat covering their body called blubber. And so most marine mammals have a big, thick layer of fat around their bodies, and that actually is what helps them stay warm. So they'll eat a lot of food in order to get a nice chubby layer that keeps them nice and warm, basically kind of like they're wearing a jacket all the time.
That sounds like me during this quarantine. I think I added on a little extra blubber being at home so much.
Oh, definitely. And now that it's getting cold, that blubber is coming in handy, right?
Definitely is. Yeah, definitely is. I'm feeling nice and warm.
Yeah. So a lot of our animals do have blubber. Alan, can you think of a marine mammal we might see right here off our coast, especially now that it's starting to get into December, January? Can you think of a marine mammal we might be seeing right here off the coast of California?
Yeah, definitely. I was just thinking, the sea lions and seals you see just off of La Jolla Cove and Pier. They have you see them if you ever been in La Jolla and you've ever walked around the cove. There's this great area where there's a population of sea lions, and then just about like a mile down the way, there's a population of harbor seals, and those guys are just so fun to look at because especially the harbor seals, they have very small little arms, and so they just kind of like waddle around, and it's really funny because they're these just big little balls of blubber and fat, and it looks you would look at them and say, oh, that doesn't look very very helpful for them because they're so fat. It looks like it's hard for them to move on land. Well, since they live most of the time in the ocean, it keeps them really warm, and it's very helpful for them. And being those animals out there having that natural like layer of blubber is especially helpful for them. Are there any other animals besides sea lions and seals I might be missing that have blubber?
Yes, definitely. They are also, all of them I think are really cute. If you guys have heard about, if you look kind of out into the ocean sometimes, you might see some puffs of air coming out from the water. Mm-hmm. Our marine mammals, like our whales, also have blubber. They use that to help keep them warm as well. We're starting to see animals like whales, who another way of kind of keeping themselves warm is by migrating. So we're
Oh,
starting to see gray whales. Yeah, it's really cool. They migrate down the coastline, all the way up from the cold waters of Alaska, Northern California, everything like that, down to the warm waters of Mexico where they go for breeding.
yeah, and I can imagine going all the way up to those northern feeding grounds. That water gets even colder than it does here. So especially whales, going all over the place. Traveling from such warm areas like Baja all the way up to feeding grounds around Alaska and Canada. That's got to be extra handy for them.
Yeah, it definitely helps them out. Imagine we take vacations to warmer places in the summer, so I guess technically humans do migrate sometimes as well. But these guys, they do it every year, and it's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
COVID doesn't stop them from traveling.
Yeah. And I'd say even with those animals, that's a good example of an animal that moves around to stay in like a warm area. So as water temperatures get too cold, maybe like a food population isn't as available for like those whales. They're able to migrate down to a warmer area. So they're taking like a yearly vacation. So that's another cool way that animals can also handle the coldness, is just getting out of it, going somewhere nice and warmer. And that sounds like a pretty fun getaway to me.
Exactly. Yeah. So they kind of have figured out what to do, because what they'll do is they'll feed so much in the in the summers when they're up in the feeding grounds that they won't need to feed on their way down. So they just kind of slowly will lose that fat that they've built up as they're going down, and then once they get down to the breeding grounds, it's warm. They don't need that layer of warmth anymore.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of like a bear hibernating. He eats like a ton of food, and then he goes and he hibernates for the winter, and he doesn't need to eat for a while because he's stored up so much of that. So that's cool. It's kind of like a little common practice that those mammals are using during the cold winter times.
Exactly.
So speaking of marine mammals, and we talked about blubber, I can imagine that not every marine mammal does have blubber. Something that comes to mind is sea otters, right?
Exactly. And those guys do live in kelp forests. They live a little bit further north where the water is chilly kind of year round. So there's there's seasonal differences. They still live where it's pretty cold. And if they don't have blubber, they kind of need something else, because they're not going to be able to survive without something to keep them warm. So
yeah, and if I had to guess, it probably has to be their nice furry hair that keeps them warm, right?
Exactly. You're exactly right, Alan. Their hair is actually the thickest of pretty much every animal out there. They have more hair in 1 square inch of their body than we have on our entire head.
Wow.
Which is wild. Like they have up to 1 million hairs per square inch. And
jeez.
Yeah, it's basically just a really thick sweater that essentially is so thick that it stops their skin from ever getting wet. Like it's so thick that their skin never gets wet. So they are constantly grooming that fur just to make sure that it stays water repellent, which is crazy.
Yeah.
You think that they live their entire lives in the ocean, but their skin never gets wet.
And isn't that why when you see like otters a lot of the times in those really cute videos, you see them just always going like, they're like fluffing up their fur? Isn't that like that? They're not just like, I don't think they're just itching. I believe it's they actually like they fluff it up, and it just like helps keep them like warm and dry and stuff, right?
Exactly. And they're definitely very cute. You can definitely look up videos of these wonderful creatures just doing exactly what Alan said, and exactly what he demonstrated as well. It's basically the exact same thing. It's like I'm looking at a sea otter right now.
I was going to shave, but I kept my beard so I could be the best sea otter I could.
We appreciate that, Alan. Thank you.
Yeah. So, I'm a method scientist. I like to play the part. But I think just a little fun fact about sea otters, something they're actually like a really, really important species. Not only do we like them because they're so cute, but they're really important to the kelp forest we have here. So one big problem for kelp forests is overgrazing by sea urchins. So sea urchins really love to eat giant kelp. And if there's not something there to eat the sea urchins, well, then they could, the sea urchins could take down like an entire area of kelp forest. They love to eat that stuff. It's one of their favorite things. But luckily, we have sea otters in certain areas we call them keystone species. So a keystone species is it's a species that is very, very important to a specific area. And that means that the actions of that keystone species really affect the outlook of that area. So, for example, with the sea otters, what they like to do is go down, pick up sea urchins. They come up, they break them open with shells and rocks, and they eat the sea urchins. And so, even though the sea otters may not be the biggest populace of like an area, them eating the sea urchins, making sure that the sea urchins don't eat the entire kelp forest, has them play a really big role in the kelp forest. So that's why we call sea otters keystone species.
Yeah, definitely. Because if you see, looking at all of this kelp, you'll see how many animals are depending on the kelp. Like there's a lot of different species of fish, some sharks, and a lot of invertebrates as well. Everything depends on the kelp forest. So if the urchins were to consume all of it, it wouldn't really be a home for so many diverse species anymore. So sea otters are definitely very important to the ecosystem. And yeah, and it doesn't hurt that they're so cute as well.
Yeah, it's a double win. And as you can see from our kelp cam here, there's so many species we see out there. You know, you see some moray eels, you see some kelp bass, you see some Garibaldis. If you look close enough, you'll see some leopard sharks and horn sharks in there. So these kelp forests have extremely high like biodiversity, which means a lot of different animals living in there. So it's important to have those marine mammals like sea otters, you know, keeping those areas nice and intact for all those animals that live there. So I know we've talked about marine mammals keeping warm, but I see a lot of fish swimming around in here. How do they stay warm? Because they don't have I don't see a lot of blubber on these fish, and I don't see much hair on them either.
Exactly. Yeah, the fish aren't as chunky as our marine mammals are. So fish basically have this really cool thing. It's kind of a complicated concept called countercurrent heat exchange. It's something that a lot of animals will use, and essentially, it's the blood that's inside of like on the inside parts of their body is very warm, and they'll actually transfer the heat to the outside parts of their body. So basically, it's kind of complicated, but the warm blood heats up the cold blood, and it's really cool to see that like they've figured out a way to actually keep themselves warm without being without having that needing to have so much weight on them.
Yeah, and that kind of reminds me, if I had to put it into like a different kind of perspective, that kind of reminds me of the phrase, just because it's off the stove doesn't mean it's not cooking anymore. And I don't know if that's a good phrase or if I'm just a bad chef, but I think the phrase was like, oh, if you like when you're cooking something, you don't want to like burn the outsides of it. And so you might like take it off the pan and just, it could still be warm. And just because it's not, you know, sitting on your pan still cooking, the heat from like the outer parts and the insides can still continue to cook that piece of food for like a little while longer. Not the exactly same concept, but in a way it's kind of similar, because what the fish do is they use a little bit of that internal heat to keep the colder outer parts warmed up, which in a way it's like the food I was talking about. You cook something, maybe it's not 100% done, but you take it off the pan, it still has that heat, and it's sharing that heat throughout that piece of food, kind of like what the fish are doing with their countercurrent exchange. I don't know if that's the best example, but that was what came to my mind when you mentioned that.
I like that. I haven't heard that before, but
Yeah,
I think that's a great way to explain countercurrent heat exchange.
Yeah. Cool. So I think a good way to come back from after talking about the marine mammals and the fish inside there is now looking at the last thing in there, which is the giant kelp itself. And so the giant kelp can actually be affected in a few ways. There's a few different abiotic factors that affect kelp forests and how they grow and you know, just their livelihoods. And so when I say abiotic, that means something that's not living. So when we say biotic factors, that could be like a living factor, and abiotic is like a natural factor, something like light, something like weather and wind. And so one big difference I noticed, Anshika, between kelp forests is that it's actually not the same in all the kelp forests. There's some seasonality differences. And one of the biggest differences I noticed when looking at how winter affects kelp forests is especially in central California. kelp forests that are at a much bigger risk due to big winter storms. Now, have you ever traveled up along like the central coast at all during winter, Anshika?
Yeah, I've definitely seen that kelp forests, they're kind of in the winter a lot more sparse because the big waves and the big storms will kind of break them apart a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of like the bigger winter storms you see up near like Santa Cruz, San Jose, these places where you get really big waves and things like that, depending on how big like a winter storm is, it could completely remove like an entire area of a kelp forest based off of like that strength of the storm. So holdfasts are really good at their job and holding on to substrates for the kelp, but sometimes they're not strong enough, and so I think especially if you go up to Central California and Northern California, especially during the winter, you'd probably see a lot more kelp on the beaches than you see here. Because when you walk around the beach here, you do see kelp from time to time washed up on the beach. But I can imagine that after those big winter storms, there'd be a lot more kelp washed up on the beaches there.
And what's really cool about when you see kelp washed up on the beach is that there's actually a lot of stuff still living in that kelp, because kelp kind of has all of those fronds and those blades and stuff. A lot of things get kind of tangled in the kelp after it's been pulled off the bottom. So if they wash up on the beach, sometimes you can find a lot of really cool crabs living in them. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you might even see like an octopus or two. But it's really cool. If you're ever on the beach and you see kelp, you'll probably find a lot of cool stuff. I just went tide pooling a few days ago and I found some empty shark egg cases in the kelp washed up on the beach. So it's really cool to see.
Were they horn or swell shark eggs?
They were horn shark eggs.
Nice.
Yeah, so it's really cool. And we got a lot of horn sharks out here right off our coast. So it's really cool that you can actually see all of these things that live in the kelp forest. Once they've been washed up on the beach, you can definitely still see a lot of really awesome things.
Yeah. And so this actual when the storms actually remove areas of kelp up in Central California, it's also more commonly removing like blades and upper parts of the canopy. So the parts that are, as you can see, the kelp is floating up to the top because it wants to get closest to the sunlight. That's where it's like productivity is the highest. And in these areas where they have these winter storms, what happens with the kelp is that top layer, it's that canopy layer, just like in the rainforest, there's a big canopy. A lot of that gets removed. And so what happens in those more northern Central California areas of kelp forest is their peak season of growth actually happens in the fall. And then what happens is when those storms come, they remove a lot of like areas of the canopy, maybe an entire like holdfast of a kelp. And then by the end of winter, when it's next spring, there's a lot less kelp and stuff on top, which allows for more light to reach towards the bottom areas of the kelp forest, which allows it to start growing a lot more, usually in about March. So for those more northern Central California areas, you'll see the growing season for the kelp usually be more from about March to around November. And then in those December through February winter months, you get a lot more of those storms removing areas of kelp. And one like kelp, I believe a giant kelp plant lives for 7 years, but it usually doesn't live that long in these areas where they get removed seasonally. It just depends how strong the storms are that year. But for the kelp up there, you'll notice it growing mainly from about March to fall. But then down here, while we do have big winter swells and bigger waves, those don't really remove as much kelp. And so I believe the term perennial kelp forests means they're kind of around here more year round, because we don't have those removing events like those kelps, like kelp being removed from storms. And so for these areas, the actual peak like kind of growing time for kelp forests is more in winter and early March. So kind of like the opposite of those kelp forests, which I believe has a lot to do with the amount of nutrients in the water.
Exactly, yeah. And kelp really thrives in cold, nutrient-rich water. So it's definitely very important for, like, that's why our kelp forests here do so well, is because the water will get warm, but it won't stay warm. Like with the whole upwelling and all of that, the water won't stay warm. So it actually helps our kelp forest thrive and grow, because though kelp really relies on photosynthesis, the nutrients in the water are very helpful and will actually help our kelp grow very well. And that's why we have such rich, beautiful, diverse kelp forests. If you guys ever go snorkeling or scuba diving, you'll be able to see all of these animals in our kelp exhibit and more, which is really awesome.
Yeah, and so that term upwelling we mentioned earlier, that is a really cool kind of phenomenon that happens in the water. And so what happens, what upwelling actually is, it's like it's a shift and movement in the ocean water. And so it happens along the coasts mainly here that we notice it. And so when you have a surface wind blowing against the water, what happens is the warmer water on top starts to move. And as that water is shifted and moved from the wind, it's replaced by colder water underneath it. So as that water is shifted from the wind, colder, more nutrient dense water moves up to replace it. And so that's how these upwelling events can cause, a quick change in the ocean water. Like I mentioned, last summer at one point it was nice and in the 70s, and then it felt like it dropped, 10 degrees within a couple days. And that happens due to upwelling events. And so that actually, the upwelling creates really good, an environment with high productivity for the animals. So Anshika, how do you can you explain potentially how, the bringing of nutrients up to the level increases like the productivity of that upper level?
Yeah, so a lot of these creatures will need kind of those resources that come from the nutrients. So a lot of we have a lot of tiny little creatures called phytoplankton, which will actually use those nutrients in order to survive and just kind of create a more rich environment. They're kind of at the bottom of the food chain. So as other animals eat them, things like that, it actually provides a lot of good things to the environment. Just it kind of keeps the productivity levels high, keeps our organisms and our food webs kind of continuing to develop.
Yeah, and so we like to say it sort of fertilizes the surface area. And so, what happens when you take a fertilizer, you're putting like extra nitrogen, I believe it is, into like your grass and your garden and other things. And so it's just like the same thing like when you're fertilizing your garden. The upwelling event is just bringing these nice nutrients to these areas where you're going to find more animals. And as you can tell, like with our kelp forest, there are so many animals living in there. And so when you have like a food chain and a food web with this many animals, just pumping in more nutrients to that is just only going to help that food chain and that environment thrive. So, next time if you're in the ocean and it's if like you're around here and you're a local in San Diego and it gets really, really cold and it wasn't cold a few days ago, it might be a little uncomfortable, but just think, the fish and everything in the kelp forest, they're loving it right now, and it's a good time for them. So that's really awesome to think about, because it's not fun when you're swimming and it's like 70 and then the next day it's in the 50s. But now looking at it, I like to think, it's a big change for the animals down below, and it's really beneficial for them, which is really cool.
Yeah, and I do see a question from Bree. She asks, aren't scientists helping to grow kelp in specific areas? That is a really good question. I'm not sure of that specifically, but because kelp is so important, as kind of we've been talking about, scientists are definitely studying this organism, this algae, because it's a great indicator of how well a community, how well an ecosystem is doing.
Yeah, great question, Bree. And yeah, so I know kelp is definitely used for like a lot of different things as well. So that would definitely be something cool to look up. I think I might check that out later as well. And
yeah,
so
because what's really cool is actually all of this kelp that's in our exhibit right now, it is actually all live kelp. And that's really cool because a lot of aquariums aren't able to put live kelp into exhibits because it requires such specific conditions. But you might be able to notice that our water is moving back and forth a little bit. Very relaxing, I do say so myself. that's actually a little pump that's creating an artificial current, and that's how all of this kelp has been transplanted from the ocean into our exhibit in order to kind of mimic the real environment. So it's really cool to see that kelp is able to survive in an exhibit. Very few aquariums have been able to do this. So I'm definitely proud of our aquarium for being able to create an artificial habitat where real kelp can live.
Yeah, and it's awesome to think too that it's able to grow and live like that, because giant kelp is one of like my favorite organisms in the ocean. It seems weird to think that a plant's one of my favorite things, but it grows 2 to 3 feet a day, which is just, I think that's just like a mind blowing fact that something can grow so fast in such a great area. So yeah, that giant kelp and the fact that we can have it grow in this really cool tank is just really awesome. One of my favorite tanks at the aquarium. And so I know also too, in addition to winter storms and changing in water temperatures, things like that, there's another big change that's going on that's really cool that has to do with the tides, right? And I think you went tide pooling yesterday, Anshika. Do you want to could you tell us about what's going on at the tide pools right now?
Yes, it's super cool. So if you guys have been out in the ocean or kind of just even driving by the ocean the past few days, you might have noticed that tides were either really low or really high. And that's actually because of this thing that happens every so often called a king tide. So right now we're actually seeing some of the highest highs and lowest lows of our tides. Like when I went tide pooling on Sunday, we actually saw a negative 1.5 foot tide. So very, very low. I was able to actually walk from the marine room almost to the shores, to La Jolla shores. So places that aren't really normally exposed, you're getting to see a lot of creatures and a lot of areas that are normally completely covered in water. Like as we were walking, we actually were talking about how normally we'd swim over this area.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So it's definitely really cool to see. And because of this, you can actually go tide pooling when the tides are super low. So like I was saying, a lot of creatures who normally you wouldn't see because the tide normally covers their habitat, you can actually see just by walking and being very careful when you're tide pooling. You can sometimes spot some lobsters, some crabs, sometimes, if you're lucky, maybe even an octopus or two, which is really cool. And with that kelp that's being washed up as well, you can definitely find a lot of really cool things there as well. So I think today's actually the last day of the king tides. So if you want to go tide pooling, I believe the low tide is at around 4 p.m. today. And I think it's negative 1.6 feet, which is really low, crazy low. I feel like it never gets that low. So definitely, if you're in the mood, you have the time, definitely go. Even if you don't go tide pooling, take a look outside. Go to the beach and actually just look at how low the tide is. It's the landscape definitely transforms, and it's really cool to see how different a beach looks at normal tides and at king low tides.
Yeah, I was gonna go on a big coastal bike ride this afternoon once after this, so I'm glad you mentioned this the last day, because I'm gonna make sure that I go to the tide pool and check it out. Oh, and so I see Delisa has a great question. I'm glad you brought this up, Delisa. She asked, "Can I touch the animals in the tide pools?" And kind of a rule of thumb is we don't really like to touch animals when you're out there. Anshika, how did you interact with the animals when you were checking out the tide pools?
Yeah, so what I was doing when I was out tide pooling is I was kind of walking around, bending down, looking at tide pools, but mostly just looking with my eyes, because these guys are already facing a very harsh environment. We just want to kind of observe them, not really bother them in any way. We don't want to accidentally pick them up, move them to a different tide pool or anything like that. So definitely looking with our eyes is going to be what you want to do when you're seeing these animals. And sometimes it does look a bit slow, like you don't notice anything. But I promise if you kind of stand, the longer you stand still looking at a tide pool, the more likely it is you're going to see something.
Yeah, definitely. So always good to go out and make sure you're just being very mindful and respectful of the animals while you're out there, because when we go out there, we're going into their home. So yeah, definitely a good practice just to look with your eyes, and yeah, sometimes you just keep looking, and it's like one of those Find It books, or it's like Where's Waldo. It's like there's so much, and you could look at one spot forever and see so many new little things that pop up. So
And
yeah, that's definitely cool. I'm so excited to go tide pooling later today.
And always be careful, watch where you step, because a lot of animals blend in really well to the tide pools as well. So always kind of watch with your eyes, make sure you're stepping in places that don't have animals. So keep an eye on that as well if you decide to go tide pooling.
Well, I think that just about wraps it up for us today. Had a great time talking with everyone about the winter in the kelp forest and about our animals here. Again, if you're one of our local visitors here in San Diego, definitely try to go out, check out that king tide today around 4. Like Anshika said, it's one of the last days to check out the lowest tides of the year. Maybe also you can go check out some of those blubbered marine mammals off at La Jolla Cove, or just even catch a good sunset. There's always a good time at the ocean these days.
And definitely, if you decide like you want to go look at our marine mammals, our seals or sea lions, definitely keep in mind to just, again, look with your eyes. Keep distance from them. A good rule of thumb when when you see a marine mammal is if it's reacting to you, you're too close to it. So we definitely want to keep our distance from the marine mammals. I know they're really cute, but we want to make sure that we keep our distance and make sure that the animals stay safe. And if you're interested in watching our kelp cam, remember it is available on our website 24/7. You won't really see much if you go at night. It'll just look kind of dark because it's actually, oh, look at that. We actually have a little guest here today.
I'm glad they could pop in. So we got our scuba Santas and his little helper elf you can see in here flowing around. And so Santa, he actually has his own little way of staying warm inside there. Him and his helpers, kind of similar to the blubber that you see on a lot of our marine mammals. Anshika, what do we use for our blubber when we go in the ocean?
Yes, so even though Alan and I have definitely built up a solid layer of blubber this quarantine, that's not enough to keep us warm. We wetsuits are really what we use. So you'll notice underneath the wonderful scuba outfit, our divers, our scuba Santas actually have wetsuits on to keep them nice and warm. So it's just like our own blubber. And look, they're having a little dance going on right now.
They love it down there. It's the underwater winter wonderland of the ocean. So yeah, just the way that the marine mammals come up with themes like blubber to end up keeping them warm. It's just one of the many cool things that we can learn from nature, and we've able to kind of manufacture. So having those wetsuits, that's like our way of putting on some artificial blubber.
Exactly, and it definitely helps keep warm. You can wave at Scuba Santa and his elf. Definitely a great way to keep warm in the ocean, and also here in our tanks, because the water in our tanks is just the same temperature as the ocean. So they need to suit up just as if they were going out into the ocean.
Oh yeah, looks like they're having a great time. Look at that elf is getting down.
Yeah. And remember, you can definitely tune in. Although our live stream might be ending soon, you can definitely tune in and keep watching these adorable Santa and his elf swimming around, having a great time on our kelp cam. And we just dropped the link to that in the chat as well. So feel free to click on there. They'll be in there for a little bit. They're doing some nice work to help keep our nice and clean.
Yeah, a lot of those fish. I think most of those fish in there are on the good list. So they're getting some presents in there.
Yes.
Cool. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. Had a great time tuning in and talking with you guys. I definitely missed getting to interact and do these live streams with you. And for the next few weeks, we're going to continue doing these. We do have a chat planned next week. Again, me and Anshika will be talking about symbiosis, a really cool concept about how different animals work together in the ocean. So that's going to be really fun. You're going to wave bye to the Santas. And yeah, we'll see you guys actually next week. Same time, same place. Another great topic. So
stay warm, everyone. Bye.
Bye.